Somewhere in Bavaria, April 1945, the rail siding stood empty except for a single boxcar, its door padlocked from the outside, rust streaking down weathered wood. American troops advancing through the valley heard it first, a sound like wind through hollow pipes, thin and rhythmic. Breathing. The sergeant approached with his rifle ready, expecting ammunition or supplies or nothing at all. Instead, he found scratches on the door's interior surface, fingernail marks carved into wood. When they broke the lock and pulled the door open, 23 German women stared out from the darkness. They had been locked inside for 10 days. No food, no water, no light. Staff Sergeant Thomas Mackenzie was 31 years old, from Pennsylvania, and had seen enough of the war to believe nothing could surprise him anymore. He had fought through Normandy and the Ardennes, had liberated French villages and cleared German towns, had witnessed the full spectrum of what humans could do to each other when civilization collapsed into violence. But the boxcar surprised him. His unit 3rd Battalion, 398th Infantry Regiment, was mopping up resistance in the Bavarian countryside southeast of Munich. April 29, 1945. The war was clearly ending. German forces retreating or surrendering in whole divisions. The infrastructure of the Reich crumbling faster than anyone could document. They had been ordered to secure a rail junction near a small village called Garmisch, check for sabotage or abandoned equipment, then push forward to link up with other Allied units converging on the Alps. The rail siding appeared abandoned. Tracks ran straight through farmland that had gone fallow, wildflowers pushing up between wooden ties. A single boxcar sat on a spur line, disconnected from any locomotive, its wood bleached gray by weather and time. Nothing about it suggested urgency or importance. But then Mackenzie heard the breathing. He held up his hand, stopping the patrol behind him. 6 men, rifles ready, eyes scanning for ambush positions. The sound came again, faint, rhythmic, like wind through a broken window. Except there was no wind. The April afternoon hung still and warm, spring light turning the distant mountains gold. "You hear that?" Mackenzie asked his corporal, a kid from Ohio named Jensen, who had remarkable hearing and absolutely no sense of self-preservation. Jensen tilted his head, listening. Coming from the boxcar. They approached cautiously. War had taught them that everything could be a trap, abandoned equipment, injured soldiers, even sounds of distress designed to draw soldiers into killing zones. Mackenzie kept his Thompson submachine gun raised, finger near the trigger but not on it, following the protocols that kept you alive in combat. The boxcar door was secured with a heavy padlock, the kind used for valuable cargo or prisoners. Mackenzie examined it without touching anything, looking for tripwires or explosives. Nothing. Just a padlock and a door, and that sound continuing from inside. Breathing. Definitely breathing. Multiple people breathing in ragged, uneven rhythms. Mackenzie called out in English, then in his terrible German. "Hello? Where ist da?" The breathing stopped. Complete silence for perhaps 5 seconds. Then a voice, female, speaking German too rapidly for Mackenzie to follow. Other voices joined it, women's voices, urgent and desperate, words tumbling over each other. "Get the bolt cutters," Mackenzie said quietly. Jensen ran back to the half-track, while Mackenzie and the others maintained defensive positions. They didn't know what they were opening. Could be enemy soldiers using women as camouflage. Could be civilians caught in some local dispute. Could be anything in this landscape where normal rules had stopped applying months ago. Jensen returned with the bolt cutters. Mackenzie positioned 2 men with rifles aimed at the door and cut through the padlock with 3 hard squeezes. The metal gave way with a snap that sounded too loud in the quiet afternoon. He pulled the door open. The smell hit first human waste and unwashed bodies and something else, something like decay mixed with desperation. Sunlight poured into the boxcar's interior, illuminating a scene that would stay with Mackenzie for the rest of his life. 23 women sat or lay on the wooden floor, most of them too weak to stand. They wore remnants of military uniforms, Wehrmacht auxiliary corps, medical staff, communications personnel. Their faces were hollow with starvation, skin stretched tight over bone, eyes enormous in shrunken faces. Some raised their hands against the sudden light, squinting after days of absolute darkness. Others simply stared, too exhausted for any reaction beyond acknowledgement that the door had finally opened. "Jesus Christ," Jensen whispered behind Mackenzie. The women nearest the door tried to speak, mouths moving, but only whispers emerged. One of them, perhaps 30 years old, with short dark hair and Sergeant S insignia on her torn jacket, gestured weakly toward the back of the boxcar. Mackenzie's eyes adjusted to the dim interior, and he saw two women lying motionless, their stillness suggesting they had moved beyond exhaustion into something worse. Mackenzie shouted, his voice sharper than he intended. "Get the medic up here now." He climbed into the boxcar, moving carefully among the women, trying not to step on the hands or legs that sprawled across the floor. The interior was perhaps 20 feet long, maybe 8 feet wide, a standard freight car designed for cargo, not people. No windows except small ventilation slats near the roof. No sanitation facilities, no water. The floor was covered with scratches. Our fingernails had carved marks into wood counting days maybe, or simply something to do with hands that had nothing else to occupy them. "Water," one woman said in heavily accented English. "Please, water. We're getting it," Mackenzie said. He called back to Jensen. "Canteens, all of them. And get on the radio, we need medical transport. Multiple casualties. Severe malnutrition." The woman who had spoken English was perhaps 25, with blonde hair matted against her skull and lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. She wore a medical corps armband, though the Red Cross symbol was barely visible beneath layers of grime. "How long have you been in here?" Mackenzie asked. 10 days, the woman said. Her voice was barely audible. "Maybe 11. We lost count." "Who locked you in?" "German officers. Retreating, they said." She paused, gathering strength to continue. "They said we would be released when they reached safety. They said someone would come back, but no one had come back. The officers had fled, abandoning their own personnel, and the women had been locked in darkness for 10 days while the war ended around them." The medic was a Brooklyn kid named Shapiro, who had seen too many dead people and not enough living ones worth saving. He climbed into the boxcar with his aid bag and took perhaps 3 seconds to assess the situation before turning pale. "We need a hospital," he said flatly. "These women need 4 fluids, antibiotics, proper treatment. I can stabilize them here, but do what you can," Mackenzie said. "Transport's coming." Shapiro moved through the boxcar with practiced efficiency, checking pulses, examining eyes, making quick triage decisions. The 2 women at the back were dead, had been for perhaps 2 days, their bodies lying where they had collapsed. The others were in various stages of dehydration and starvation, but alive. Barely alive in some cases, but breathing, conscious, able to respond to stimuli. The unit's canteens appeared soldiers, passing forward every container of water they carried. Shapiro rationed it carefully, allowing each woman only small sips. Too much too fast would cause more problems, shock their systems, potentially trigger cardiac issues. He explained this while working, his voice calm and professional, despite the situation's horror. "Small amounts. Just wet your mouths. More later." The women accepted the water with shaking hands, some crying silently, some simply drinking with the concentrated focus of people who had forgotten what moisture felt like. The blonde woman who spoke English translated Shapiro's instructions for those too weak or disoriented to understand. Mackenzie stood outside the boxcar, organizing the evacuation. They had already radioed for medical transport, but the nearest field hospital was 15 miles away, and the roads were clogged with refugees and retreating German units and the chaotic traffic of war's final days. It would take hours for ambulances to reach them. We'll use the half-tracks, Mackenzie decided. Load them carefully. 3 or 4 per vehicle. Jensen, you drive the first one. Take the worst cases directly to the field hospital. They worked quickly but gently, lifting women who weighed perhaps 90 pounds each, carrying them to vehicles where blankets had been spread across metal floors. Some women could walk with assistance, leaning heavily on soldiers' shoulders. Others had to be carried, their bodies limp and unresponsive. The dark-haired Sergeant Mackenzie had noticed first was among those who could still walk. She moved slowly, each step deliberate, one hand braced against the boxcar wall for support. When Mackenzie offered his arm, she took it without hesitation. "What's your name?" he asked. "Obergefreiter Marguerite Hoffmann," she said in careful English. "Medical Auxiliary Corps. Assigned to field hospital near Munich. How did you end up in that boxcar?" Marguerite's expression flickered something between anger and resignation. "Our unit was evacuating. Officers ordered all female personnel onto a train. Said we were going to rear positions, somewhere safe." She paused, catching her breath. "But the train stopped here. Officers got off, locked us inside, said they would return. That was 10 days ago. They just left you?" The war was ending. They needed to escape. We were, she searched for the right word, inconvenient. Mackenzie helped her into a half-track, settling her onto blankets beside 2 other women who were unconscious or sleeping, impossible to tell which. He wanted to say something, wanted to express the rage he felt at officers who would abandon their own people this way. But words seemed inadequate, so he simply said, "You're safe now. We're taking you to a hospital." Marguerite nodded. Then, unexpectedly, she reached out and gripped his wrist. Her hand was skeletal, all bone and tendon, but her grip was firm. "Thank you," she said, "for opening the door." The 67th Evacuation Hospital occupied a converted schoolhouse outside Garmisch. White sheets hanging as room dividers, surgical equipment set up in what had been a gymnasium, recovery wards arranged in former classrooms where children's drawings still decorated the walls. It was designed to handle combat casualties, gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, battlefield traumas. Not mass starvation and dehydration, but the staff adapted. They always adapted. Captain Elizabeth Morrison was the head nurse, 42 years old, trained at Johns Hopkins, hardened by 2 years of combat medicine in North Africa and Europe. She met the half-tracks when they arrived, took one look at the women being unloaded, and started issuing orders. 4 fluids for everyone. Normal saline, slow drip. Get them cleaned up, carefully watch for skin breakdown. Small amounts of broth only, nothing solid yet. And I want vitals every 30 minutes until they stabilize. The hospital had 20 beds available. The women filled most of them, lying in rows with 4 bottles hanging from makeshift stands, blankets pulled up to their chins despite the warm spring afternoon. The nurses moved between beds with quiet efficiency, checking temperatures, adjusting fluid rates, speaking in low, gentle voices. Marguerite Hoffmann remained conscious throughout intake, answering questions when asked, providing information about her companions when they could not speak for themselves. Morrison interviewed her while another nurse started her 4. "When did you last eat?" Morrison asked. 10 days ago. Morning before we were locked in the boxcar. We had bread, a little cheese, and water. First 2 days, we had canteens. After that, Marguerite gestured weakly. Nothing. Some women tried to drink their own urine. It made them sicker. Morrison made notes on a clipboard, her expression professionally neutral, despite the horror of what she was recording. Did anyone die before today? 2. Greta Schneider. She was 50, older than the rest of us. Her heart failed on day 7. Marguerite's voice remained steady, reporting facts without emotion. And Anna Richter. She was 19. Yesterday morning, she just stopped breathing. "I'm sorry," Morrison said. "Don't be sorry." Just help the ones who are still alive, Morrison nodded. She understood triage, understood that grief was a luxury reserved for after the immediate crisis. We'll do everything we can, she said. Then, unexpectedly, you were medical personnel yourself? Yes, 3 years in field hospitals. France, Poland, Russia, back to Germany. Then you know how this works. Rest, fluids. Food gradually increased. Your bodies need time to remember how to process nutrition. I know, Marguerite said. I've treated starvation before. Just never experienced it. Morrison placed a hand on Marguerite's shoulder, brief contact, professional but kind. You're going to be fine. All of you. You survived the hard part. But survival was more complicated than simply staying alive. The first 3 days were critical. Bodies that had been starving for 10 days couldn't transition immediately to normal eating. The digestive system shut down during prolonged starvation, and reintroducing food too quickly could trigger refeeding syndrome, electrolyte imbalances, cardiac failure, death even after rescue. So the nurses measured everything. Small amounts of broth every 2 hours. Gradual introduction of easily digestible foods, applesauce, crackers, mashed potatoes. Constant monitoring for complications. 2 women developed severe edema, their bodies unable to process the sudden influx of fluids. 1 suffered cardiac arrhythmia that required emergency intervention, but none died. By day 4, most of the women could sit up. By day 6, some could walk short distances with assistance. Their bodies remembered how to function, cells regenerating, systems restarting, like engines that had been cold too long, but whose fundamental mechanisms remained intact. Marguerite recovered faster than most, her relative youth and previous physical conditioning giving her advantages. By the end of the first week, she was helping the nurses translating for German-speaking patients, assisting with basic care tasks, becoming an informal liaison between the rescued women and their American caretakers. Morrison assigned her light duties officially on day 8. Don't overdo it, she warned. Your body's still recovering. I know my limits, Marguerite said. And sitting idle makes me think too much. Think about what? Marguerite was silent for a moment, staring out the window at the Bavarian mountains rising in the distance. Finally, about the officers who locked us in there. About what it means that our own people abandoned us. About, she paused, about everything I believed being wrong. Morrison had no response to that. She had heard similar sentiments from other German prisoners and civilians, the slow crumbling of ideology when, confronted with reality, the disorientation of discovering that everything you were taught was built on lies. She simply nodded and returned to her rounds. Staff Sergeant Mackenzie visited the hospital 3 days after the rescue. He brought a military police investigator, Lieutenant Arnold, from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, tasked with documenting potential violations of military law for post-war tribunals. They found Marguerite in the recovery ward, helping a nurse distribute afternoon medications. She looked dramatically different from the skeletal figure Mackenzie had pulled from the boxcar, still thin, but with color returning to her face, strength returning to her movements. Miss Hoffman, Arnold said formally, I'd like to ask you some questions about your detainment. They moved to a small office that had once been the schoolteacher's workspace. Arnold produced a notepad and pencil, prepared to document testimony. Mackenzie stood by the door, not officially part of the investigation, but present as the soldier who had made the discovery. Can you identify the officers who ordered you into the boxcar? Arnold asked. Marguerite provided names, ranks, unit designations, information delivered with the precision of someone trained in military protocols. Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, Oberleutnant Klaus Dietrich, both from the 19th Panzer Division headquarters staff. They were evacuating ahead of American advance, commandeered a freight train for their personal use. And they specifically ordered female personnel into the boxcar? Yes, 23 of us. Medical staff, communications operators, administrative personnel. They said we were being evacuated to rear positions. Said the train would take us to safety. Did they indicate how long the journey would take? No. They locked the door from outside. We assumed it was temporary security measure, that we would be released when we reached destination. Arnold made notes, his handwriting small and precise. When did you realize you had been abandoned? Marguerite's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes' memory, of fear transitioning to understanding, to the slow horror of realization. Second day. We were still on the siding, hadn't moved. We could hear vehicles passing, could hear voices sometimes, but no one came. By third day, we knew. They had left us there to die. Did anyone try to escape? The door was locked from outside, padlock. We tried to force it, but she gestured at her thin arms. We were not strong enough, and the ventilation slats were too small to squeeze through. Did you attempt to attract attention? Of course. We shouted. We screamed. We banged on the walls. The first few days, we made constant noise. Her voice dropped slightly, but no one came. Either they couldn't hear us, or they heard and chose not to investigate. Eventually, we became too weak to make much noise. Arnold continued his questions for another 30 minutes, documenting every detail of the abandonment, the conditions inside the boxcar, the deaths of the 2 women. When he finished, he closed his notepad and said, "This testimony will be used in post-war tribunals. The officers responsible will be held accountable." Marguerite nodded, but her expression suggested she didn't quite believe it. "The war is ending," she said. "Everyone will say they were just following orders. Everyone will claim they had no choice. That defense didn't work at previous trials," Arnold said. "It won't work at future ones." After Arnold left, Mackenzie lingered. He had no official reason to stay, but something about the situation demanded acknowledgement beyond formal testimony. "Finally," he said, "for what it's worth, I'm glad we found you when we did." Another day or two. Marguerite didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. They both understood how narrow the margin of survival had been. "Yeah," Mackenzie said. Another day or two. The women began writing letters as soon as they were physically able, cramped, careful script on whatever paper the hospital could provide, messages attempting to reach families scattered across a Germany that barely existed anymore. Marguerite wrote to her sister in Hamburg, though she had no way of knowing if the address still existed, if the building still stood, if her sister was alive to receive the message. She wrote anyway, because the alternative was accepting that everyone she had known before the war might be gone. "Dearest Lot, I am alive. I write this from an American field hospital in Bavaria. I was imprisoned by our own officers, abandoned in a locked boxcar, left to die. American soldiers found us. They saved us. I do not know how to explain what this means. I spent 3 years serving the Wehrmacht, believing we were protecting Germany, believing our cause was just. And in the end, our own officers locked us away like cargo, like things to be disposed of when they became inconvenient. But the Americans, the enemy we were taught to hate and fear, they gave us water. They carried us to hospitals. They treated our wounds and fed us and asked nothing in return except that we recover. I am trying to understand what this says about everything we believed. I am trying to reconcile the propaganda with the reality. I am failing. If you receive this letter, please write back. I need to know that someone from before still exists, that I am not completely adrift in a world I no longer recognize. Your sister, Marguerite, she never received a response. Hamburg had been bombed extensively. Her sister's apartment building was rubble. Lot had died in 1943, information that would only reach Marguerite months later through Red Cross records. Marguerite, but other women received responses. Families confirmed alive, addresses confirmed valid, small threads connecting them back to the world they had come from. Each letter that arrived was read aloud in the recovery ward, shared among women who had survived together and now celebrated each other's connections to whatever future might be possible. Not everyone at the field hospital was comfortable treating enemy personnel. Several doctors and nurses expressed reservations, privately concerns about resource allocation, questions about whether enemy soldiers deserved the same care as American casualties, debates about medical ethics in wartime contexts. Captain Morrison addressed these concerns in his staff meeting one evening, her tone brooking no argument. "These women are patients," she said firmly. "Not enemies, not political statements. Patients who need medical care. We provide that care regardless of which uniform they wore, regardless of which side they fought for, regardless of personal feelings about the war." A young nurse named Patterson raised her hand tentatively. "But Mom, my brother died at the Bulge. Fighting Germans, it's hard to... it's difficult to..." "I understand," Morrison said, her voice softening slightly. "My husband died at Anzio, German artillery, so I understand exactly what you're feeling. But we're medical professionals. That means something. It means we treat whoever needs treatment, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when we'd rather not." Patterson nodded, but her expression remained troubled. Later that evening, Morrison found Mackenzie smoking outside the hospital, staring at the mountains turned purple in the twilight. "You did the right thing," she said without preamble. "Opening that boxcar, bringing them here." Mackenzie exhaled smoke slowly. "Some of my men think we should have just left them. Let the Germans clean up their own mess. What do you think?" "I think," Mackenzie paused, choosing words carefully. "I think once you open the door and see people dying, you don't get to choose whether they deserve help. You just help. Or you become the kind of person who can walk away from suffering." "And I don't want to be that person," Morrison nodded. "Neither do I. That's why we do this work." They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching night settle across the valley, listening to the distant sounds of a world trying to remember how to be at peace. By the third week, most of the women had regained enough strength to walk independently, to eat regular meals, to participate in their own recovery, rather than simply receiving care passively. The hospital began planning for their eventual transfer to prisoner processing facilities, where they would be screened, documented, and eventually repatriated to whatever Germany would become after the war. But something had shifted in the women during their recovery, something more profound than physical healing. Marguerite articulated it during one of her conversations with Morrison. Sitting outside on a warm May afternoon, while former combat zones transformed into landscapes where farmers were cautiously returning to fields. "We were taught that Americans were cruel," she said quietly, "that you tortured prisoners, that you had no honor, that capture meant death or worse. The propaganda was very specific about this." "And now?" Morrison asked. "Now I've spent 3 weeks being cared for by Americans, being fed and treated and spoken to with kindness. And I have to reconcile this with everything I was told." She paused. "It's like discovering the entire foundation of your life was built on lies. Everything I believed about the war, about Germany's cause, about who the enemy really was, all of it was false." "That must be difficult," Morrison said. "It's devastating," Marguerite said simply, "but also necessary. I can't go back to believing what I believed before. The boxcar took that away. Not just because German officers abandoned us, though that alone would have been enough, but because the enemy we were taught to hate showed us more humanity than our own side did." This sentiment echoed through the recovery ward. Women who had served the Wehrmacht, who had believed in Germany's mission, who had accepted the propaganda as truth, they now confronted the gap between what they had been told and what they had experienced. The cognitive dissonance was painful, but unavoidable. Some processed it through anger, directing rage at the officers who had abandoned them, at the regime that had led Germany into catastrophe. Others processed it through grief, mourning the loss of certainties they had held since childhood. A few tried to maintain their previous beliefs, insisting the abandonment was an aberration, that the American kindness was somehow suspect. But most simply sat with the contradiction, letting it reshape their understanding gradually. The transformation wasn't universal or complete. Belief systems built over decades don't collapse in 3 weeks. But cracks appeared, small fissures through which new possibilities could enter. Early June brought orders for the women's transfer. They would be moved to a larger POW processing center near Munich, where official records would be compiled and repatriation procedures would begin. The war in Europe had ended officially on May 8th. Now came the complicated work of sorting through millions of displaced people, determining who went where, trying to rebuild some semblance of order from the chaos. The women received the news with mixed emotions. The hospital had become strangely safe, a liminal space between the war they had left and the future they would face. Leaving meant confronting whatever Germany had become, whatever consequences awaited them. Marguerite spent her last evening at the hospital, helping Morrison with inventory counting bandages and medications, a task that required no real skill but provided an excuse for conversation. "What will you do?" Morrison asked. "After repatriation?" "I don't know," Marguerite said honestly. "Try to find family. Look for work. Probably return to nursing, if hospitals will hire someone with my service record." "Your service record shows 3 years of competent medical work," Morrison said firmly. "Any hospital would be lucky to have you." "Maybe." Marguerite didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe no one will want to hire someone who served the regime, even in medical capacity." Morrison set down her clipboard. "Listen to me. What happened to you, the abandonment, the starvation, being left to die, that wasn't your fault. You were following orders, doing your job, trying to help people. The fact that the system you served was corrupt doesn't make your work worthless. Doesn't it?" Marguerite asked quietly. "How do I separate the healing I did from the regime I did it for?" "By continuing to heal people. By taking what you learned and using it to help whoever needs help, regardless of politics or nationality or history. By becoming the kind of medical professional who treats patients as human beings first and everything else second." Marguerite was silent for a long moment. Then, "Is that what you do? After losing your husband to German artillery?" "Every day," Morrison said. "It's not easy, but it's necessary. Someone has to remember that healing matters more than hate." Before the women left, they held a small memorial service for Greta Schneider and Anna Richter, the 2 who had died in the boxcar. The bodies had been buried in a military cemetery outside Garmisch, marked with simple wooden crosses. The women gathered there on their last morning, 21 survivors standing in a semicircle, while Marguerite spoke words of remembrance. "Greta was 50 years old," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. "She had 2 daughters in Hamburg. She joined medical corps to help soldiers, to use her nursing training to save lives. She survived 3 years of war. But she could not survive abandonment by the officers she served." She paused, gathering composure, then continued. "Anna was 19. She had been in service for only 6 months. She spoke often about her fiancé, about the farm they would run together after the war. She was kind and patient, and never complained, even when we were all suffering." Another pause, longer this time. "They deserved better than to die in darkness, locked away and forgotten. They deserved to live, to see their families again, to have futures. We cannot give them that, but we can remember them. And we can carry forward the lesson their deaths taught us, that the regime we served valued us only as tools, disposable when we became inconvenient. That truth is painful, but it is necessary." The women stood in silence after Marguerite finished, each processing grief privately. Staff Sergeant Mackenzie stood at a respectful distance, representing the American unit that had found them. He had arranged for the burial, had ensured the crosses were properly marked, had made certain these 2 women would not be forgotten entirely. After the service, Mackenzie approached Marguerite one final time. "I hope things go well for you," he said. "After repatriation." "Thank you," Marguerite said. "For everything. For opening the door. For," she gestured, encompassing the hospital, the treatment, the 3 weeks of recovery. "For all of it," Mackenzie nodded. He wanted to say something profound, something that would capture the strange circumstances that had brought them together, enemy soldier and American sergeant, connected by chance and crisis. But words seemed inadequate, so he simply offered his hand. They shook hands' firm grip, mutual respect, acknowledgement of something that transcended their respective uniforms. Then the women boarded trucks for transfer, and Mackenzie returned to his unit, and the war's momentum carried them in different directions. The investigation into the boxcar abandonment took 18 months. Lieutenant Arnold compiled testimony from survivors, tracked down witnesses, built a case against Hauptmann Werner Schmidt and Oberleutnant Klaus Dietrich. Both officers were located in a POW camp near Regensburg, awaiting processing for return to civilian life. The trial occurred in December 1946 at a military tribunal in Nuremberg. The evidence was straightforward orders given: women locked in a boxcar, abandonment resulting in 2 deaths and near-fatal harm to 21 others. The defense argued military necessity, claimed the officers intended to return, insisted circumstances beyond their control prevented rescue. The tribunal wasn't convinced. Both officers received sentences of 5 years imprisonment for dereliction of duty and abandonment of personnel under their command. Light sentences by post-war standards, but sentences nonetheless. Marguerite Hoffman attended the trial's final day, sitting in the gallery watching the officers who had locked her in darkness receive judgment for their actions. She felt neither satisfaction nor vindication, only a tired recognition that justice, when it came at all, came too late to change what had already happened. After the trial, she returned to Hamburg, or what remained of Hamburg, a city of rubble and reconstruction, where apartment buildings stood as hollow shells, and entire neighborhoods existed only in memory. She found nursing work at a Red Cross clinic, treating refugees and displaced persons, helping people who had lost everything rebuild some small piece of their lives. She never found her sister, never received confirmation of exactly when or how Lot had died. But she continued writing letters anyway, documenting her experiences, her recovery, her slow process of understanding what the war had meant and what the future might require. One of those letters eventually reached Staff Sergeant Thomas Mackenzie, forwarded through military channels with remarkable persistence. It arrived at his home in Pennsylvania in 1948, 3 years after he had opened the boxcar door. "Dear Sergeant Mackenzie, I hope this letter finds you well. I am writing to tell you that I survived repatriation, that I found work, that I am rebuilding a life from what remains. I also want to tell you something I could not articulate properly in Bavaria. When you opened that door, you did more than save 21 lives. You restored something I had lost, the belief that people could choose kindness, even when they had no obligation to do so. You showed me that the propaganda I had believed was false, that the enemy I had feared was capable of mercy. That knowledge has been difficult to carry. It requires acknowledging how thoroughly I was deceived, how completely I served a system that valued human life only when it was convenient. But it has also been necessary. I could not rebuild my life on the same foundations that led to the war. I had to start with different premises, that people matter, that healing transcends politics, that showing mercy to your enemy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Thank you for teaching me that lesson. Thank you for opening the door. With deep gratitude, Marguerite Hoffman." Mackenzie read the letter 3 times, then placed it in a drawer with his other war correspondence letters from soldiers he had served with, from families of men who had died under his command, from the scattered connections that remained after the fighting stopped. He never responded to Marguerite's letter. He didn't know what to say, didn't trust himself to articulate the complicated emotions her words stirred up. But he kept it and occasionally reread it, and when people asked him about the war, he sometimes told the story of the boxcar, not as a tale of American heroism, but as a reminder that small choices could matter enormously, that opening a locked door could change more than just immediate circumstances. Captain Elizabeth Morrison continued her nursing career after the war, working at various military hospitals before retiring in 1962. In her personal papers, found after her death in 1984, was a brief notation about the German women she had treated in Bavaria. They taught me that healing has no nationality, that suffering demands response, regardless of who is suffering. This lesson has defined my subsequent practice. I am grateful they survived to teach it. The boxcar itself was scrapped in 1947, dismantled for metal during post-war reconstruction. But its story persisted documented in military records, preserved in trial transcripts, remembered by the women who had been locked inside and the soldiers who had opened the door. By the 1980s, it had become a footnote in broader histories of World War II's final days, one small incident among thousands. One example of how the war's machinery broke down in its final weeks, leaving people trapped between collapsing systems and uncertain futures. But for those who experienced it directly, it was never a footnote. It was the moment when everything they believed was tested against what actually happened. The moment when propaganda met reality, when ideology confronted simple human need, when locked doors finally opened to reveal people who had been waiting in darkness, hoping someone would care enough to set them free. 10 days they waited. 10 days of darkness and hunger, and the slow understanding that they had been abandoned. 10 days that taught them what happens when human beings become inconvenient, when systems value efficiency over compassion, when those in power decide that some lives don't matter enough to save, but also the moment when the door opened, when water arrived, when strangers showed kindness without obligation, when healing became possible again. Both lessons mattered. Both truths needed to be carried forward. The burning they had felt from starvation eventually faded. The physical scars healed. But the knowledge remained of what humans could do to each other, and of what they could do for each other when they chose mercy over expedience. That knowledge, painful and necessary, became the foundation for whatever came next.